Alright guys, one question that I always receive most of the times related to personal finance is there a book by an African author which I'm willing to recommend to people to say, look, if you want to understand about personal finance that is related to the African continent, which book should you pick up? Well, for a long time, I actually did not have an answer because most of the books that I had read on personal finance and on investing were very much Euro or Americentric. I don't actually know whether there's something called Americentric, but by American authors or by European authors. This is probably where I learned most of the stuff that led me to try to do stuff like experiment with investing and figuring out what to do with the stock market and everything else. But I'm glad to say that I think I finally found a book that I would recommend to anyone who is on the African continent, especially if you are a youth and you'd really want to understand the basics of personal finance, narrated and written in a way that is very easy for someone who is a youth to understand. The book that I'm talking about, of course, is this book that I have here, What's Your Move by Nicolette Mashile. She's a South African YouTuber, TV presenter, and among many other things. She's a highly accomplished lady. So there are three things that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about my 3 top lessons from this book. I'm going to talk about my 3 best chapters that I think you should read if you really don't have time and you pick up this book. And I'm going to talk about my 3 observations that I have made, which I call the 3 Maro observations. Now, starting with the 3 top lessons. Lesson number 1 is that you have to track your expenses. And this is something that you can do with simple applications like Microsoft Excel. You have to figure out what you're spending. To most people, your salary just comes in and you start spending it out. You just withdraw your money on the ATM and you have it as cash, and cash is really difficult to be able to track it. The best way to track your money in this case, and something I got from this book, will be using the cards that you have. Given that most of the purchases that we do are made by cards anyway, it might be best for you to swipe out your money so that over time you compare your expenditure in January, February, March, April, and you start to figure out the guilty pleasures that you feed yourself to. You start to figure out that every month you're spending $200 on ice cream, which is something that you might not want to actually do. But then if you're not tracking your expenditure, you just see your money going out and you won't actually figure out where the money is going to. An interesting point that she made, which is very applicable to people who are not yet married, is that especially if you're in a relationship, you also have to figure out ways in which you balance your expenditure between the two of you. The best way to do this is that you have a common account which you both contribute, and then at the end of the month you say, well, we want to take a trip, a holiday trip. Do we have enough money in our joint account to be able to afford this holiday trip? When you don't do this, when you don't track your expenditure, then you're going to figure out that in the end, you're going to have money problems, because as long as you don't track your money, you don't actually know what you have to stop spending on for you to be able to have enough extra income for you to save and invest and achieve your financial goals. Lesson number 2 is that you are supposed to learn to manage your debt. The interesting thing is that as we now have so many cards floating around, people can easily access loans on their mobile phones. People can easily access loans using their credit cards depending on which economy you're living in and listening in from. One thing is that people can quickly accumulate debt even on very few small consumer items like having your nails, getting your hair done, or even getting alcohol that you simply swipe out on your credit card, and before you realize it, your debt is ballooning. And this lesson is very important, and you have to figure out ways in which you quickly pay out debt, especially if you want to restart and reboot a financial plan that you have for yourself and you want to start having enough money to save and to invest. And that lesson is something that she echoes throughout the book, which is that you need to learn to manage your debt. Of course, in the book, she goes through ways in which she suggests ways in which you can actually manage your debt, different ways in which people handle their debt. Some pay the smallest first, some pay the biggest first. It simply depends on how you look at it. Some of them look for debt aggregation agencies that can help in paying down debt. But the most important thing to realize is if at a point of your life you decide to say, look, I want to restart and to recalibrate my financial future, you have to at that point learn how to manage your debt. Lesson number 3 is that you have to learn the various investment options that are actually available to you. For many people, we do not actually know how to invest. The reason why most people find that in the end they don't actually have accumulated wealth is because when they have a few extra income, they don't know what suitable investment to make. For example, if you only know that property is the only thing to buy, real estate as they call it in other markets, then you're going to think that you probably need about 200,000, 100,000 of whatever currency that you're using in your country to be able to actually buy a decent property and start getting rentals from it. But if you had educated yourself enough, you could know that there are things like stocks or shares, which we talk about on this channel, where if you have even few hundreds of dollars or few hundreds of your currency, depending on the stock market and the country where you're listening from, you can actually start investing slowly. You figure out that over time, this could be a better way because it's very difficult for someone to just have a savings account where they will start to save enough money until you get to 200,000. In fact, people who are in real estate themselves, they don't even save up to 200,000. And this is something that Nicolette talks about in this book. And she says it's very important for you to figure out whether you're going to talk about mutual funds, index funds. If you are starting small, there are various investment options that allow you to start small and actually start investing the little you have, instead of getting into this trap where you tell yourself that, look, you know what, I am going to put all my money in a savings account until it gets to 200,000 US dollars or until it gets to 200,000 rands or shillings or kwacha, and then after that, I'm going to put it in a property. You probably are not going to do that because once you get to 100,000, a problem which is very genuine is going to come up. And it's going to force you to take that 100,000 and go and pay off something else that you really think at that point is important and something that's unlikely to be an investment. And so you have to educate yourself on the various investment options that are there and figure out what it is. And this is lesson number 3 that I got from this book. Now, let's move to the 3 best chapters in this book. I think if you figure out that you don't have enough time, but you find this book lying around and you just want to find 3 chapters, just read the 3 chapters that I really think are important and very applicable to someone who is trying to figure out their financial path, and written in a conversational style that she used in this book, is that I would ask you to look at these 3 chapters. The first chapter is chapter number 3, which she calls the Ford Mustang. It's a very interesting chapter. The way the Ford Mustang chapter comes about is that you think, wow, what is she? She's telling us how to buy great Fords and so that we all make money. But it's actually not what she's saying. This chapter is actually named after an incident that happened in her own life, which is that she arrived at a mall. She was actually going to do her business, just get in a mall, do your business and get out. Something that you just regularly do. You go to the shops, you get to a mall and you do everything. But while she was actually doing her own business, there was a car that passed, and this car was a Ford, a very exotic Ford. I think it was a G500 or something like that. I'm probably forgetting the right model, but it was a very expensive and a very uptown exotic car being driven, mind you, by a black man. And she said, you know, come on. If this was someone else who was not my race, it would probably mean that, you know, it could be race issues and they would afford something I couldn't. And she said, that's a black man. I'm a black woman. I should be able to do that. This chapter is talking about the ability for you to be able to fight instant gratification. You know what she did after she saw that car? She drove her own car to try and figure out where the next dealership was where she could buy that car. And once you get into that mode, it's probably an ego thing. You say, look, I saw a black man drive a car. I'm a black man or I'm a black woman. He is African. I am African. I can do it. I'm going to buy that car today because I definitely have money to do it. Or even if I don't have money, I definitely have a good high-paying job that I'm going to use to get enough credit for this car. But what you have to realize for every Ford Mustang you see, for every Ferrari you see, is that you don't actually know the story behind it. You don't know if someone bought it using their credit. You don't know if someone bought it using cash, which if they bought it using cash, great. It's amazing for them. But you have to know the ability to fight instant gratification. And this is something that is mentioned in chapter 3, the Ford Mustang. The second chapter that I want you to read, if you pick up this book but you don't have time to read it, the whole book, is chapter number 5, Lessons from a Jail Cell. Again, this is, she's really good at her titles. Like, these are very captivating titles, and this book, believe me, it's amazing. It has wisdom, and you laugh all the way through it as you're reading it. But what does lessons from a jail cell mean? Well, so what actually happens in that chapter is that, Nicolette, just like every other African person or African youth, she goes out, she gets drunk, she comes back. It's really an interesting day because she barely remembers what actually happened. And you know what happens the next morning? She's woken up by the police knocking her door and telling her that she did not pay for gas or fuel, which she bought last time, that she filled a car and she did not pay. But you know what had actually happened? At the back of it, what actually happened was that this was credit card fraud. This is someone who had actually used her details and to be able to clone credit cards and use it and fill their own tank without her actually being there. And of course, as these issues were being ironed out, she had to get into a jail cell where, surprise, surprise, she met a woman who was in the jail cell for credit card fraud. I'm very sad at this moment to announce that this woman was a Zimbabwean woman who was in the jail cell and who told Nicolette, a South African, that she had come from Zimbabwe and they were committing massive frauds in which they would take people's bank details, they would clone them, they would create credit cards, they would buy off things, and they would be able to actually spend this money. In another scheme, what they would also do is that they would take things, they would go and buy them, but then they would immediately go back with these new things that are unused to the shop, and then they would get cash in return. Because you swipe your credit card, and then it reads that you bought the stuff, but then you go and return the stuff, and then after that, you'll be able to get cash out, because cash is what you really need. Credit won't really do you anything. And these are the lessons she managed to learn the hard way. After being reckless with her information, after just having information floating around that other people, other criminals managed to harvest and actually use it to be able to commit credit card fraud. And this chapter, chapter 5, very interesting. Lessons from the jail cell. You have to read this chapter. Now, you have read these 2 chapters. What else could be interesting in this book? You read chapter 3, you read chapter 5. At that point, I suggest you skip all the way through to chapter 16, the black text. The black text. Wait, the chapter is actually called Conversations with My Dad, the black text. It's interesting that many of us don't talk about this topic very often. The idea that the black text, or the idea, as I'll try to explain it here briefly, that as we are growing up, we suddenly realize that once we make it a little bit financially in life, our generation, or even our parents' generation, you suddenly realize that we have these extended families that are a little bit much bigger than other parts of the world that we also have to support. You have your aunt, you have your great-grand aunt, you have your uncle's sons that might also say, you know what, hey, Tim, can you send me money because now you found a job in the capital city and we heard you're working and you're a doctor. Can we come to your house and live there? Or can you give us money so that we also buy, new clothes that are coming up? And there's one important lesson that I managed to learn from this chapter, which I really think is important. The lesson being that whenever you find yourself in a situation of black tax, you have to ask yourself whether you're paying the tax out of love or you're paying the tax out of fear. What does this mean? Well, if you're paying the tax out of love, this means that you realize that your mother or your uncle, depending on how you grew up, sacrificed everything they had for 20 years for you to go through college. You might finally manage to get it all the way through, and now you think, you know what? They deserve to have the best life, and I'm going to take all my savings and build them a house, and they deserve it. You are paying that black tax out of love. And I put that black tax in quotes because it might not actually be black tax depending on how you look at it. If you're paying something out of fear or out of guilt, you're looking at a situation where, you're going out to an event. She gives an example where she says, you have your aunt who lives some other part of town and you're about to go to the rural areas for, holiday celebrations. And when you do that, this aunt says, oh, by the way, I heard you bought a car. Can you come and pick me up in my city? And then we drive to the rural areas together. But you know very well that they might as well take the bus and things might still work out. And you don't want your relatives to say, our aunt did not show up because Maro did not go and pick them up. And this is something that reflects badly on you, but this is only because it is out of fear, but you're not probably paying this black tax out of love. And this is an interesting lesson that Nicolette has in this book, that you should figure out as you grow up, if your black tax is because of fear, and if your black tax is because of you're afraid of what people think, and you actually cannot afford to go and pick out an aunt in a nearby town, but you're just going to be forced and pretend as if you have everything and keep uploading debt on yourself, getting lots and lots of credit so that you sponsor other people's lives, then you should definitely reflect on how you are making yourself pay the black tax. And this is an interesting topic. Of course, she explains it in much broader and much more insightful ways than I can ever use in describing in this video. But of course, if you really want to get it all, you should pick up the book and read it. Now, let's get to the 3 Maro observations. What is it that I observed in this book that I think was really phenomenal? The first thing that I'm going to talk about is the conversational style. You know, there is a difference. When people write books, some people try to, to keep them very professional. They're throwing out all these complicated personal finance terms, or they're talking about, stocks and indexes and everything else. But if there is one thing that I realized in this book, is that it was written as a conversation, as if she's talking to a friend. I felt that I was sitting there in the same room with her, and she was standing on the other side, and she was giving me all these lessons. Not only was she talking as if she's talking to a friend, but she was writing this book as if she's writing for someone who is our age, for someone who is a youth who is growing up, and throwing out all these possible ways that can happen in our life, that can upscale our personal finances, that can tiptoe our personal finances. And she was really trying to have this as a conversation to youth. The second observation that I made reading this book is just how vulnerable and humble that she became in writing this book. You know what? Look, Nicolette, who started the Financial Bunny channel, a very amazing channel, by the way, that I watch almost every day. It's just an amazing channel. And she's successful in her own right. You know what? She could have started writing this book by saying, you know what? I made it. And look, I'm going to tell you how I made it, but I'm never going to tell you about the mistakes that I made. But this is not the approach that she made. She got very vulnerable in writing this book. She wrote about her past romantic relationships and how she managed money. She wrote about anything that you might want. She wrote about, her life in college and her failures, that she didn't manage to actually pass her first degree, which she did, an undergrad degree, and that she failed to do that, and that she had to dust herself up and pick it up from there. She even got to give examples about her family, her sister being admitted in a hospital, and in a topic where she talks about medical bills and how your finances can easily just flip through when you have a big bill that's coming up and medical aid is telling you that they can't cover it and everything. This book is written by someone who is very humble and someone who was really willing to be vulnerable, so that she would actually give real life examples that you would figure out that one day you say, how do I prepare for that? How do you prepare for a case where you get into a hospital, but your medical aid declines to fund it, and the bill that comes is thousands of whatever currency that you use? It's something that you will realize, and something that you will come to realize that is something that resonates with everyone, just because of the humility and just because of the vulnerability that she uses when she is writing this book. Lesson number 3, and something which I think is very important, which I got from this book, is that we have to realize that our grandmothers, especially, in their very own small way, they have for a very long time been trying to be very financially savvy and trying to start their own financial kingdoms. This is something that people might not realize, but she talks about something which is very important and something that I realized myself growing up in the rural areas in Nyanga in Zimbabwe. And this is the idea of Stokvels. A Stokvel is simply a Stokvel, depending on where you are. In Stokvel, you can call it different names. But this is essentially a group of people who bring in their money on a monthly basis, small contributions, and then it lumps up to something that actually big. If you bring in $10 for everyone and there's a group of 50, it lumps up to something that big. And then when that money is collected, it gets to be lent out to someone who decides what to do with it for that month. If they want to start a capital project, an irrigation project, improve their crops, buy more fertilizer, buy chemicals for their cattle, for their goats, next month, people come in again, they chip in, it gets lent to someone else. Over time, this can actually be very good because of the power of large numbers. If grandmothers in rural Africa have been doing this and using this as a way to survive, Nicolette gives a challenge and she says, the youth of Africa have to realize that this method works. This method not only works in rural areas, but it can work everywhere. We have social media. People have chats and accounts where they're busy talking about soccer and where they're talking about alcohol and where they're talking about many other things that might not actually concern money. And where people are actually using their own money to go and play out games and to go and to drink more and to party more. But you realize that of the budget that people have to actually be happy during the month, if they could only put in $10, put in that $10 and then give someone who would then go on to invest, you would start to realize the miracles that would happen. In our own small way, as individuals, we might not be able to buy the next thing that we want. If you are a young farmer who is in rural Africa, you might not be able to buy the chemicals that you need. You might not be able to buy the irrigation system that you need, the solar irrigation system that you need. But if you have a group of like-minded farmers who are willing to chip in and we figure out a way to aggregate our own savings, we could be able to drill a bore where all our cattle can come in and drink. We could be able to buy a block of shares in a local company when foreign investors are about to divest and leave the country. We have these situations most of the times. You have big foreign investors, big pension funds, they say, you know what, we think our return in this company has gotten to a level where we really want, and we are about to sell 10% that we hold in Old Mutual that is listed on the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange. If they are a group of very woke young men and women in Zimbabwe, they might realize, you know what, let's aggregate our own savings and let's just buy 10% of this Old Mutual. How is that important? It's important because that is a block of shares which, if it's being controlled by people, they can really determine policy. They can tell Old Mutual, as the 10% shareholders, to direct that money to invest in African youth if they get a board sitting or anything else. But if you start to realize that if all these people were just buying one share, they won't have their power of large numbers in order to force or in order to direct some of these corporate actions of the corporations that are running on the African continent. So, the important lesson here is we have to be able to realize that it is time for us to start our own version of Stokvels, where people are pulling in resources, where people are pulling in knowledge, where people are pulling in all the materials that they have, so that we can be able to get to the next level. The talk of property that most people talk about, that they want to invest in property, but they don't have enough money. They only have enough money to aggregate it over 10 years. You can find a group where 1 year the money is given to a person, and then next year people bring in the same amount of money, of course adjusted for inflation and many other things, and then it goes to the next person in the group. A year could be a long time. This could happen almost every month, and people can begin to realize how this will change their financial futures. This is something, and of course many other lessons that you get when you read this book. It's an amazing book, guys. I really think it's just so good that I don't know. When I finished reading it, I felt like, you know what, I have to start reading this book again. Of course, if I have more time in future, it's something that I really think I would read again because the lessons keep getting better and better. If you have a chance, if you have the resources, if you have the connections to be able to get this book in your hands, I really do suggest that you get it, and I really do suggest that you read it from cover to cover. It's worth it. It's already, as I see here, a national bestseller, which I assume is in South Africa where Nicolette is from, but I'm pretty sure that this book deserves not only to be an African bestseller, but even a world bestseller. It's a book that's told through the life and lessons and not the complications that you'll find in many personal finance books. There is something about it, the authenticity of it, that connects to someone with an African background, and you feel that this is something that I really want to do. These are the lessons that I really think would apply to my life because of your background and because of everything else that you have lived through. It's a book that I really think once you read it, you will be able to recommend it to your friends and your friends won't be disappointed, just as I hope you won't be disappointed when you read this book. But well, I think I've talked enough, and until next time, my name is Maro. See you then.